Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, mail.wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening.
Advantage of, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the phone calls I've been getting in the office recently. It's near harvest time and some of the plants are coming to maturity, and one of the things that we're starting to get calls on, like we get calls on every year, is blossom end rot. We had a really wet spring and then we had a dry period and then it started raining again. So that's a really good opportunity for our plants to start to not have the proper calcium uptake from the soil. So calcium is not really a mobile nutrient. For a lot of nutrients, plants will self-cannibalize. They'll pull nitrogen from the leaves, or they'll pull potassium from the roots. They'll just start eating themselves to make that fruit so that the next generation can go on, right? All parents do that. Parents will always make sure their kids have good, healthy food, and if they have to go a little bit hungry, that's usually what happens. Well, plants do the same thing. They want to make sure that their reproductional system goes onward and can create new plants. So that's where they're going to focus most of their nutrients, even if it causes deformities in the parent plant itself. So one of the things I want to start with is tomatoes, because everyone loves to grow tomatoes. One of the things you can see, if you have blossom end rot on your fruits every year, and basically that means that the bottom part of the fruit that's hanging off the plant, the bottom part starts to rot, and the rest of the fruit is fine, and the leaves look great and everything else looks great, but those fruits are just rotting from the bottom. First, you can still eat the fruit, just cut the rotten part off and it's fine. Blossom end rot will not hurt you. It's just a physiological disorder that means that those cell walls didn't get enough calcium when they were first forming. So nothing you can do at this point in the game will help your plant not have blossom end rot, because those cell walls were damaged when it was just getting formed. And so it happens while it's just coming out of the blossom. And so while if you have new blossoms on there, you can definitely do some calcium supplements to help reduce that rot. But for most of the plants that already has set in, the damage has already been done, and the plant will have a very hard time to repair those cell walls once the rot has begun. All right, so that's unfortunate, but like I said, you can still eat the top half of the tomato, just cut off the bottom half. Some things you can look for when you are suspecting a calcium deficiency, especially early on in the growing season when you still have blooms, is if you see upward cupping of the leaves, maybe they're dead around the outside edges, that is a good indicator of calcium deficiency. It could be a couple other things too, but when the leaves are cupping upward and the edges are dying back, that is typically a symptom of calcium deficiency. And so the best way to improve your calcium is A, make sure that your pH is correct, and B, make sure that you are watering evenly. Unfortunately, nature doesn't like even watering in this area. We get a whole lot of water or we get no water. But where tomatoes are from, they get a regular rain shower every day during the rainy season. And that is what the tomato has developed to want. So if you are growing tomatoes, you need to make sure that you stay on top of that water during the time when those fruits are forming. And that will help make sure that you don't experience blossom end rot when it comes time to harvest. Another thing that you can do if you are continually having issues with blossom end rot is seed directly into the soil. I know everyone likes to get their tomatoes started early inside the house, but what that does when it grows in a rooting medium, it has a lot of open pore space. And so the roots are growing out sideways, and you get secondary branch roots, and you get a lot of good fibrous roots, which help pull in nutrients. However, water in our soil typically is deep. And so if you keep having problems that show maybe there's a water issue, then if you plant that seed directly in the soil, it's actually going to develop a much deeper taproot, which will be able to help regulate water issues. So when you are planting your tomatoes next year, if you have issues with blossom end rot, try to find a way to plant them out in the soil. Now, the difficulty of this is that tomatoes want 60-degree soil to germinate in. And if you plant when the soil is too cold, then you can have a lot more dampening off and all sorts of those fungal diseases that are associated with cold soil. So what you can do is you can warm the soil in a specific area using a cut-off milk jug or a bell vase or something like that, so that light can still get in, and it will trap it so that the cold air isn't sitting on top of it. That will help slowly start to warm that soil. You want to put it out a couple weeks before you want to put your seeds in, so that has time to heat the soil itself. And a soil thermometer is a great investment. Basically, it's a standard metal tip thermometer that is strong enough to be stuck into the soil. You can use your compost thermometer if you have one of those. Basically, it just needs to be a thermometer that you can put in the soil. And you're going to want to put it down about 2 inches into the soil so that you really get an idea for your starting roots if it's going to be warm enough down below. So try to warm up your soil ahead of time and using a cover, and then continue by testing your soil. As soon as you hit 60, you can put your seeds in. And then, of course, keep them covered and keep them well watered during that germination period, and you'll have much better success. Another thing you can do is when it starts to bloom, when you start getting flowers and they start becoming fertilized, then you want to add a little bit of extra calcium at that time, because that is when the blossom end rot is occurring, is at flowering, when those flowers are just starting to set fruit. All right, so now let's say your plants are growing a little more slowly, your leaves maybe are smaller or very light green, and I'm talking about the older leaves. The older leaves maybe have a really bright green veins in them, but yellow everywhere else. That is a nitrogen deficiency. And you can tell because it's the older leaves. The younger leaves are actually cannibalizing the nitrogen out of the older leaves. A lot of plants are actually exhibiting symptoms of nitrogen deficiency right now because of the rains that we had. It leached a lot of the nitrogen out of the soil, and unfortunately that's left our plants a little hungry. So if you notice a slight discoloration on the lower leaves or the older leaves of your plant, maybe a little bit of nitrogen right now during the very heavy growing season would be a good idea. Unfortunately, we can't really test for nitrogen in soil. We usually do a tissue test for nitrogen, but you can use a rule of thumb as if your older leaves are yellowing with green veins still showing, and also sometimes if it's really severe, your newer leaves, your young leaves, may have purple veins, and they'll be pale as well. That's a severe nitrogen deficiency, and you really do need to give it a good dosage of nitrogen. Nitrogen is also going to make your stems thicker and harder. So if you're growing a plant that you're going to eat the stems, you definitely don't want that. And also, if your flower buds turn yellow and then fall off, that could also be a nitrogen deficiency. So there's a reason nitrogen is the big nutrient that everyone talks about, because it is really important to plant growth. In fact, when you are looking at nitrogen levels in the plant, when the plant first starts out, the nitrogen is accumulating in the leaves. But once it's past the seedling stage, the nitrogen in the leaves goes down to about 80% by the time fruit starts to set. And then by the 84th day, only 33% of the total nitrogen is in the leaves still. 52% of that's in the fruit. So at harvest, about 24% of the nitrogen is in the leaves, but 68% is in the fruit. So nitrogen is important to fruits. It's not just a leafy thing. Now, nitrogen is leaves, and a lot of times when we say you're not getting enough fruit, or if your fruit isn't setting, that you have too much nitrogen, that's definitely a possibility. But if your flower buds are just turning yellow and falling off, and you may have some pale, sickly looking leaves, you may want to try a little boost of nitrogen. Now, if your leaves are really dark green and they have the purple interveinal tissue on the underside of them, that's typically a phosphorus limitation. Again, if your stems are slender, they'll still be hard and fibrous, but they'll be really thin as opposed to a nitrogen where they're thick. So the phosphorus limitation, you're going to get little spindly stems, but they'll still be fairly hard. And you can apply extra phosphorus at planting time. When you're first planting your tomatoes, put the phosphorus around the seed. That's going to help develop your root system and give you a stronger, healthier plant overall. As far as potassium, you're going to see that in young plants with dark green leaves and really short internodes. So they look really bushy. Your leaf tips could also be spike-like, almost like they've been hit with some pesticide or herbicide. Your young leaves may be crinkled and curled, and your older leaves would be more of a bronzed or chlorotic, where it's pale in between the veins. So those are just some things that you might be seeing on your tomatoes, right? So know by looking at your tomatoes now what you need to plan for next year. But also keep in mind that if your plant is showing a disease, then you want to move that plant next year. You do not want to plant your tomatoes in the same spot this year or next year if you had a disease this year, because most of the diseases that affect tomatoes are soil-borne, and they will, at the first rainstorm, splash up on the bottom of the leaves and reinfect your new plants for next year. Typically, we prefer you to be able to move them 300 feet away from the last place you planted them. I understand people with small gardens, that's not a possibility, but do try to move it to the opposite side of the garden, or better yet, work with a neighbor or a friend, and you do cucumbers this year and they'll do tomatoes, and then switch off. That will help reduce diseases and issues on all of your plants by doing it in that manner. Each person trades off a plant family for the year, and you just share the crop, and it makes a great neighborhood as well. All right, so I know some of you out there, especially those working with high tunnels, may have experienced some hot weather tomato problems. It got really hot and it's been really moist. It's been really hard on our plants, and if you don't have shade cloth on your high tunnel, it probably got super duper hot in there, even with all of the vents open. And keep in mind, if you are building a high tunnel, you want to make sure at least 20% of the area is ventable to allow for airflow when needed. Some of the things you would see as a result of hot temperatures would be poor fruit set. And again, it's, going to have to be well pollinated. So you have to make sure that you are encouraging extra pollination by bringing some bees into a high tunnel, the kind that pollinate tomatoes, and encouraging them to be there and enjoy some nectars on the side. If the plants don't have viable pollen because the temperatures were really hot, say above 90 degrees during the day and 70 at night, you're going to get reduced fruit set simply because the pollen isn't as viable as it should be. Night temperatures are probably more critical than day temperatures, so we really do need some cool temperature in the evenings for tomatoes to be beautiful. If you are seeing a delay in ripening, or the fruit is not ripening properly. So one of the things is, if it's slow to ripen, sometimes you get that hard white center in it. And that's mostly connected to the variety of tomato you're growing, but it can also be an indicator of heat stress, and it can also be an indicator of improper fertilization. Again, looking at the variety of tomato, knowing what type of nutrients it needs and what type of nutrients are in your soil. If you over-fertilize, those hard white centers could be a result of over-fertilization, or it could be a result of a low potassium in the soil. So it's really, you have to do those soil tests. If you are a high volume producer, especially in a high tunnel, normally we recommend soil tests every 3 years, but for a high tunnel with a high volume production system, I would even recommend every year, just to keep an eye on your nutrient levels, keep an eye on those salt buildups, and make sure that you are adequately letting the soil rest in your high tunnels. All right, so also that yellow shoulder, again, this is a physiological disorder where the top of the fruit stays yellow and the bottom turns red. And the yellow area will never properly ripen. It's going to be tough. It's not going to taste really good. And again, this is partially related to the variety of tomato that's being grown, but it could also be associated with temperature and improper nutrition. All right, so we also want to make sure that we are trying to make sure that we have adequate potassium. Again, potassium is necessary for fruit development. And so early in the spring, you give them nitrogen, but you do have to make sure that they have enough potassium to get a good, healthy fruit. And also calcium in the early season when the fruit is first forming. That is what causes blossom end rot, is if the calcium isn't available, or there's too much or not enough water, or just inconsistent water. Calcium is not a very transportable nutrient, and so you have to have pretty consistent water in order for you to avoid blossom end rot problems later on in the season. All right, again, that white core is connected to improper fertility and also excessive heat or not enough leaf cover and overexposure to the sun. So you do have to make sure that when you're pruning off those leaves to keep them away from the soil and encourage fruit development, then you definitely want to make sure you leave enough to have good coverage for the fruits so that they don't get sun scald or have heat problems. All right, so another crop that can be harmed by hot weather are your cole crops. In any cold weather crop, really, your cole crops, your root crops, your kale, your chard, your lettuces, none of them really like hot weather. But cole crops that are being grown for income, you want to make sure that you are giving them appropriate moisture levels to help keep them cool. So when crops get hot, like let's look at cabbage, for instance. Cabbage just kind of stops growing once the temperatures get over 77 degrees. And broccoli and cauliflower are even more sensitive to those high temperatures. And when you get those high temperatures on these cold weather crops, they just sort of go dormant and just kind of wait and try to wait for a cooler day. So sometimes what you can do is put a shade cloth over them. But keep in mind, row cover actually traps heat. So if you're covering them with an insect cover or something like that, try to make sure that you are doing it in a way that does not trap heat. Make sure your insect cover is a dark, like a shade cloth, or something that is going to allow some heat to escape without letting those pesky insects in. So you also want to watch your planting date when you're looking at cold weather crops. Actually right now is a pretty good time to start some cold weather crops inside because you probably have your air conditioning on, or you have a nice shady spot where you can get them started. Cool, moist conditions, they'll get started pretty well. And then when the temperature starts falling in mid-September, you can actually go ahead and start sowing them for a fall crop. So just keep that in mind, that if you are wanting to grow cold weather plants, you're really going to want to try to give them the conditions that they want, or they're going to be more prone to disease or just outright crop failure. You also could potentially put down a white plastic mulch to reduce the soil temperature. That can help your cole crops. Black plastic and clear plastic are known to warm the soil. but also just making sure that you are, if you are planting a fall crop, that you do have some row cover on hand for if we do get a fall frost. There are also two diseases that affect our tomatoes right now. And one is Septorial leaf spot, and the other is early blight. So early blight is a fungus, just like late blight, but it does survive in the winter in our area. And most commonly, this is reintroduced to the garden because when you clean your garden out at the end of the season, you maybe leave some plant material behind. So this is one of those diseases that it's essential to make sure that you are clearing out all old plant material from the garden at the end of the year. And you also want to make sure you're sterilizing your stakes. If you use wooden materials for your tomatoes, you want to make sure that you are soaking them in a 110 bleach solution for at least 20 minutes to make sure that it is getting into the center pores of that wood, because that wood could be potentially carrying a disease that will affect your tomatoes. Also, straw can carry the fungal pathogen. So you have to make sure that your straw that you're using is not going to help to transfer this pathogen. All right, so early blight, you can look at the leaves and you're going to see maybe 5 to 10 circular brown spots on a leaf. They'll be up to 1/2 inch in diameter, but here's the key. They're going to have concentric rings or ridges that form a target-like pattern surrounded by a pale yellow area. Now, as the disease progresses, those spots are going to merge together. They may kill the whole leaf, and over time, the stem and fruit could also be infected. Your fruit's going to show dark, sunken lesions on it. Again, still surrounded by that yellow halo. Now, late blight spots are caused by a different pathogen, and they'll start out as a pale green, usually near the edges and the tips of the foliage. Then they're going to turn brown to purplish black, and you'll see, just like with cucurbit downy mildew, there'll be a fuzzy mold on the underside of the leaves when they're put into a very humid environment. Now, late blight is dangerous because it really very quickly hits the stems and fruits. You're going to have plants with a leathery brown appearance. And that is the late blight that you really need to be on the preventative lookout for. Now, Septorial leaf spot. Again, it is a disease that can overwinter in our soil. Your Septorial leaf spot is going to have a whole bunch of little brown dots that have a diameter of a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch. So little tiny brown spots on the leaves with gray or tan centers. Now, these spots have a dark brown margin compared to the early blight's pale yellowness. Now, as the Septoria spots mature, if you look on the bottom of the leaf, you'll see little tiny brown pimple-like structures. They're called pycnidia. Those are the fruiting bodies of that particular fungus. So this isn't going to grow a fuzzy covering like late blight will, but Septoria will have little dots underneath those leaves that you can identify. So your early blight, you're going to have those concentric rings making a target-like appearance with a yellow surround around those concentric rings. Your late blight, it's going to be brown or purplish on the edges of the leaf. And your Septorial leaf spot, you're going to have spots with gray or tan centers, little tiny spots, and dark brown margins. So how can you prevent these things? Well, you always want to use certified seeds. You want to use them from a reputable company or seeds that were kept from disease-free fruit. If you are keeping your own seeds, there are several steps you need to take to kill any pathogens, bacterial or fungal, that could be in the seed when you're storing it. So make sure that you are taking proper steps if you save your own seeds. There are varieties that are resistant to early blight. Mountain Fresh Plus F1, Juliet F1, Tommy Toe, Old Brooks, and Cabernet F1 are resistant to early blight. Okay, so complete resistance to Septoria are not available, but the variety Iron Lady has a tolerance to the disease, as well as the West Virginia 63 variety. and a similar tolerance to the Iron Lady. Those are the ones we have that are resistant to Septoria. So again, that is definitely one you want to manage by removing old plant material from the garden, not composting diseased plant material, and rotating your crop area. All right, and also, one of the things a lot of people miss when they are rotating their crops is the weeds that are around them. We have a lot of native solanaceous weeds that will carry the same diseases that affect our tomatoes and our potatoes. They have the same family, so therefore they can carry the same disease. So make sure when you're looking at your plants and your garden area that there aren't any solanaceous weeds around the outside of the garden area, maybe on the other side of the fence, that could be holding that disease before it transfers back over. You also want to make sure that you are pruning the lower leaves and stems close to the soil surface, and that you are using a mulch or a something to prevent the soil from splashing up in rain. Drip irrigation is much better than sprinkler irrigation for disease prevention, both for plant pathogens and human pathogens. So drip tape really is just the best way to go. You get the best bang for your buck because you're not losing a lot of moisture through evaporation, and you are watering the root system, which is where the plant takes up water, and not the leaves, because water on the leaves is where these fungal pathogens take hold and get into the plant. So you do want to water in the morning so they have the full length of the day if you do get the leaves wet to dry. Watering in the evening actually encourages fungal pathogens to grow. You also want to make sure your plants are spaced out to allow good air circulation and allow sunlight to get through. And as I said before, at the end of the season, make sure that you're removing all plant debris from the garden. Burn it or bury it by deep plowing. That means deeper than 6 inches. And making sure that you do not compost any diseased material. Those are awesome steps to help keep your plants healthy. Now, if you are trying to protect your plants from late blight, bottom watering through drip irrigation, spacing your plants, these are just standard cultural practices that can protect pretty much any plant from an infection. And again, it's not going to be foolproof. There's going to be times that these pathogens do affect it, but you want to provide your plants the best chance of survival by planting them with enough space, giving them enough sunlight, making sure their nutrients are managed properly, not too much, not too little. There is definitely a too much of a good thing. They need sunlight, but too much sunlight causes heat stress, and they need water, but too much water causes fruit cracking. So it's just finding that little balance, and it is a juggling act every year because nature does not like to let us get too comfortable in how we do things.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.